is do you guys have this going, or are you still? Okay, awesome. Our video crew was pointing at their computer, and I had concerns. So anyhow, yes, so we're just going to there are several centurions that show up in Scripture, and we're going to take a little bit of time to look not only at this story, but at those stories, and then a little bit at how the Roman army organized itself and how centurions work in to that system. And one of the things that I chose to do when we started this long series on the book of Luke was I thought, when I see something that I want to study, I'm just going to study it and talk about it. So if you don't like that kind of thing, there's lots of shallow preachers on the radio and on the YouTube channels that you can go to if you'd like to, or you can just, go back and rewatch Sunday's sermon or something like that. Anyhow, but we're going to be looking at this a little bit, but let's begin by reading the story as kind of the springboard for this study. In Luke 7, beginning of the chapter, it says, "Now, when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving. For, quote, he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue." Verse 6, Then Jesus went with them. And when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, "I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel." And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well who had been sick. All right, so there's our story about the centurions. And part of what I'm doing is for us to get a little bit better, or maybe you know a lot about this and you don't need it, but hopefully a little bit better idea of what this centurion is talking about when he says, I am under authority and I have people under me. So that's what we're going to look at. When you look at the various parts of the Roman army, there are some words that crop up. And I want to just kind of go through how this works. And you will see that the centurion, here's our friend there, the centurion is kind of towards the bottom of this group. And there's just some interesting things. I spent about a day researching the legions of Rome, and there's a lot of really interesting information out there. Rome had an army. That should not surprise you. Almost every empire that's been successful has had an army. Usually a pretty good one, or else they would be an unsuccessful empire. Or perhaps a kingdom paying their rent to another kingdom with a successful army. And they had, the way the Roman army was set up is they had various legions were kind of their major unit in their army. And you hear about legions all the time. It's a thing that's out there. If you were in the legions, you were a legionnaire. That's what you were. Whatever level you were a legionnaire. And it's kind of like in our armed forces is if you're, in the Air Force, your Air Force. If you're a Marine, you're a Marine. And it doesn't matter if you're the top of the stack or the bottom of the stack. You're just a Marine wherever you are in that process. The Legionnaires were that way. And they, in the Roman army, they actually had a variety of different legions. And one of the things that was interesting about the legions was they were always changing numbers. I mean, a legion would have the same number, but how many there were would change. And so if a legion got wiped out somewhere, they might or might not take whoever was left and create a new legion with the same number. Or they might just come up with a new number. And there were several famous legions that were out there that did various different things. And the legions always had a number and a nickname. And so that was one of the things. They had the Macedonian Legion. They had the Spanish Legion. They just had different legions that did different things. In around 5 AD, there were 20 legions. And they know that for a fact. And by the time they get to about 300 AD, there were 40 legions. But the 40 legions may or may not have been accurate because a poet at that time said, when he was talking about people who were against the emperor, he said, don't ever argue with someone who has 40 legions at his disposal. And so that may be a rounded number. But the fact of the matter is that it's really hard to know how many legions were actually in play at any given time. Because we haven't found any big tome, that's down in the catacombs of Rome or the library of the Vatican or somewhere like that has year 30 AD. Legion number 1 was here for this many years, and Legion number 2 was there, and Legion number 3 didn't exist anymore. But Legion number 4 was there. There's nothing that's like that. They're just trying to figure out where people were and when they got started and when they got stopped. And so they're the best guess among a lot of squabbling is at the time of our story, there were 25 legions. There were also auxiliary troops that were not legions. And this was actually important to the Romans. If you were going to become a legionnaire, you already had to be a citizen. Okay? You couldn't be a legionnaire if you weren't a citizen. But if you joined the auxiliaries as a non-Roman citizen and put your 25 years in and was released at the end of that with a good record, they would make you a citizen. Okay? If you were a legionnaire when you retired out of the legions, often they would give you a plot of land and a certain amount of money. And so the incentives were different for both groups. Throughout the period, a common thread that you read from the people that were actually living through it was everybody assumed that there was approximately the same number of legionary soldiers of Rome as non-legionary soldiers of Rome. That it was about equal. You could be a Roman citizen in the auxiliaries, but most Roman citizens would become a legionnaire instead. The other thing is that where there are big battles, there are usually more legions involved, less auxiliaries. Where you are closer to Rome and important cities to Rome, there are more legions, less auxiliaries. When you get out into kind of the hinterlands of the empire, which Palestine was one of the hinterlands of the empire, you have more auxiliaries than you do have legions. As a general rule, when you read Roman soldier in the New Testament, that is almost certainly an auxiliary, but it could be either. if you're just passing by, if you were walking through Jerusalem or walking through Capernaum and you saw a Roman soldier, there would be a very high chance that that Roman soldier was an auxiliary, not a centurion. Okay? One of the reasons for that is that there weren't any legions stationed in Palestine until after Titus conquered Jerusalem. And then the 10th Legion took over. And so the 10th Legion is there in Palestine, but that's after 70 AD. So up till this point, it's mostly auxiliaries. And one of the things about the auxiliaries is they usually were drawn from other countries besides Rome. And so when you watch movies and things about Jesus and the Romans, those who are historically accurate will have very few, and often only the very top people in the group, very few of them will actually be Romans. And there were all sorts of people. In fact, Josephus, who wrote about the Jewish War, the revolt against Rome in 70 AD, he blamed most of the problem to the Syrian Roman soldiers that were in the auxiliaries. He said, it's those Syrians, those dirty, rotten Syrians. That's why we revolted, really. And of course, Josephus is writing this after Rome had already conquered. He said, really, we love Rome. Now, if you read the New Testament, you might doubt Josephus's word about that entirely. But that was what he would say. So most of the Roman soldiers were auxiliaries, but there were some legionnaires that would have been in Palestine, because one of the things that the Romans really liked to do was take legionnaires and after they retired, give them parcels of land out in the far countries. And they thought what that would do is that would get people to want to be more Roman. You have these people with a piece of property and a lot of money to spend, and that would tend to make people for instance, in Palestine, the Jewish people want to be more Roman. Again, if you read the Bible, you know it didn't work that way very well. That was not really what happened. But those are the legions, the 25 legions of Rome. The person who commanded a legion was a general. The person that commanded an army was a general, and sometimes they would have multiple field armies out. Obviously, you couldn't fight in Spain and in Palestine at the same time. So you'd have different field armies out there, but whoever was in charge of an army was a general. The type of people that were generals was often the very upper crust of Roman society, and often either the emperor or the guy who was just about to become the emperor was a general. Because going from general to emperor was a really great way to change. That was one of the things that happened commonly in the empire. And today, so I have some modern equivalents for, as you kind of try to piece these together for today. We have armies and we have generals in charge of armies. So that's kind of that's a thing. The legion, which we have some recognition of, was usually about 6,000 soldiers. And they would, on the ground, be anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000. Those numbers get thrown out as how many. But when the demoniac in Gennesaret says, we are called legion because we are many, and then the demons are cast into the herd of swine, and they go storming down the hill, as they thought of legion, these are the types of numbers that they would have thought, okay? And so thousands of soldiers would be part of a legion. The person in charge of a legion was called the legate. You may hear that occasionally when you read or see things about this time period. Usually the legate was an aristocrat of some sort, a landed important person. Often they were senators. Sometimes they were equestrians, which I don't know how well you've got your Roman history, but the equestrians were like the cream of the crop of the of the people that weren't Praetorians. And but anyhow, so they were the big important people, and the legate usually was not a professional soldier. The legate usually was someone that would be a legion commander for anywhere from 3 months to 3 years, where the typical soldier went 25 years for their tour of duty, so to speak. And so the legate was considered kind of the political non-soldier in charge of a lot of people that were, as you might expect, kind of looked down on by most of the troops that were under them. They didn't think this guy that was here for 3 months to order us around and probably blow several battles and get lots of us killed. They didn't think very highly of those types of people being in charge of them. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they were smart, sometimes they did well, but a lot of times the legates were complete disasters. The next level down, so in the legion there are 10 cohorts, the next level down was run by a centurion. And so the centurions were like the officers that were the glue that made the army happen. These were very, very important people in the Roman legions, in the Roman armies. The most senior centurion of all of the centurions in the legion, those were the leaders of the cohorts, and so they were, and each cohort had 6 centuries. And so the 6 centuries had around 80 soldiers, and so you do the math, you end up with 480 soldiers in a cohort. If you're thinking in terms of today's things, a legion would be about the size of a division. Normally, a major general is in charge of a division. A cohort is about the size of a brigade. A colonel is usually the title, if you are aware of army ranks. The main thing to get straight with army ranks, if you know many people in the army, is never get corporal and colonel mixed up. That can get you in a lot of trouble because those are quite different ranks. And so the colonel, and then the centurion in kind of today's army would be the equivalent of a captain. So I would say that that's a fairly important position. And an interesting thing, even though they're called centurions, when they were figuring out who had what, a centurion always had 80 soldiers. And I know that doesn't make sense, but the guy that's below him, the decanus, so it would be like, instead of centurion, if we said the decurion, the guy in charge of 10 people, he was only in charge of 8 people. And I'm not sure why exactly that is, whether the horse, the cavalry, whether that group, they were trying to kind of keep it out at about 500, 110, but then once they started doing things. But if you know anything about the military, you know once they kind of get going in a certain direction, the traditions of the army kind of take over. And a lot of times you do things not because they're the best way, but because it's the way we've always done things. Actually, sometimes churches do that too. Maybe it's just human nature. I don't know. But that was their system. And so someone that was a centurion would be in charge of at least 80 soldiers, if not almost 500 soldiers. And when we run into centurions, that was kind of the level between captain and colonel. That's kind of the level that these people that are called centurions would have been. The other thing that I want to say here is that in the auxiliary, they were called different titles. And a lot of people get, like, there's arguments about this because you run into centurions in the Bible But most of the people that are in charge of soldiers in the Bible aren't centurions. The thing you have to remember is that actually they're not centurions. They're a Greek word that is the Greek translation for centurion. And that word gets used for all sorts of things. And so, for instance, when we use the word captain of some other country, we usually just mean the person that's roughly equivalent in their army to what we call a captain. Okay? So that's just a little bit of the background there. Okay, so that's how they set up their army, and it was in some ways the wonder of the ancient world. Now, I thought you might enjoy this next slide. This is what a centurion in Jesus' time would have looked like. So, a few things here. Now, they both look like they were pulled from the Gallic army, which actually they had centurions that looked like that. Paul probably looked very Jewish, and he was a Roman citizen. So he could have, had his gifting been more brawn and less brain, he might have been a Jewish-looking fellow that looked like this. But the centurion, the way you knew you were looking at a centurion through most of Rome's history was they were the guys whose plumes went like this. Okay? The officers, the people that were in charge of people that were below the centurion, their plumes went like this. And so a lot of times you see people get this wrong. But the more, you'll notice more modern films and things will usually get this right. It is called a transverse horsehair plume. Early on, they were all sorts of different colors. Very common, especially among the English centurions, was like stripes with kind of fat stripes. So black, white, black, like that. And so you'll actually see that as people try to dress up like Romans. Another thing that you'll see is that the centurion did not typically wear the big clunky breastplate. Okay, so we always think of breastplates on Roman soldiers, but they didn't necessarily, and there were a couple reasons for that. Sometimes they did, depending, and they were allowed to, depending on what battle they went into, but often the centurion's job was to make sure his men went forward when the time came to go forward. They were in charge of things. And in fact, the main tool that the centurion, there's a couple things that happen. So the centurion gets medals of honor, so you'll see those on, and this is actually fairly accurate, and you'll see like stone carvings of people with these things on their chests that are centurions. And they would get those for either personal acts of valor or company acts of valor. So if their group did something amazing, they would kind of wear what their group had done well on their chest. And so in some ways, they were a little bit of the mascot for the group, but a very serious mascot. The other thing that was different was when you went from pre-centurion to centurion, and this is something that is commonly gotten wrong by those who do reenactments of Roman soldiers, is your sword switched from your right side, usually right about here, to your left side. And the reason is because a normal Roman soldier, their shield was a big, big deal. In some ways, the shield was their first and last weapon. And that's what Roman soldiers did particularly well, was they would go and their shields would create this wall that protected them while they were kind of crushing the other army back, occasionally stabbing over their shield with their swords. The centurion sometimes used a shield, but not as much. And so there was actually a ceremony that they did when they became a centurion where they had their sword changed to the other side of their body. And that was considered a step of honor for them. Their main weapon was called the vine staff. The vine staff's purpose was for hitting soldiers. Okay? And now you might think, I thought that's what the sword's purpose was. No, the sword's purpose is for hitting enemy soldiers. The vine staff's purpose is for hitting your own soldiers. In fact, there's a story of a centurion whose nickname from the troops was another staff, because he'd broken so many over recalcitrant troops that he would just be whacking at people and be like, wham, crack, and he'd be like, another staff. And then someone would have to give him another staff. And then, last but not least, in the centurion's gear is you have the help. Ensign expendable, minor secundus, whatever you want to call him. The guy that is there so that if the centurion needs to get information from the legate, or he needs information from the general, or he needs to go prepare something back at the camp, or he needs to communicate with another squad that's somewhere else, he has someone that can go running and taking care of those things for him. And you will notice that the help looks a lot like a normal soldier, here without his helmet on. They did usually wear helmets in battle. It wasn't like if you were the help, you didn't get a helmet. But that's because he was a normal soldier. And often what would happen is the centurion would just look at his 80 guys and say, you know what? You look fast. You're the one that I'm going to use as my runner. And then that guy's job would be to go with him wherever he went. So that's a little bit of a picture. And so when you think of the centurion, this is pretty accurate to what the centurion would have geared up as. Obviously, if the centurion was just going about their business, relaxing at home, going out to see Jesus, he wouldn't have been in full armor. Probably would have looked like many other Romans that perhaps you've seen. But I thought you would enjoy this picture of the centurion, so you have kind of a little bit more accurate idea of what this guy looked like. All right. What kind of people do we see as centurions in Scripture? Well, we see this guy, Luke 7:2. A certain centurion servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. And I didn't put all of it down because you know the story. Someone that was an important person in Capernaum, someone who had donated, a wealthy person, so he had money. It is possible that he is a retired centurion. That's very possible. The story says nothing about how old he is. If someone is called a centurion, that doesn't mean they're actively in the army at that point. And if you've ever known someone that was a colonel or a general or a lieutenant, maybe not a lieutenant, maybe lieutenants by the time they get done, they want to forget they were in. But anyhow, at a certain level, they kind of hold on to those names as, as their former position in the army. Perhaps one of the most famous ones that have not been in the army for certainly for a long time is Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame, right? When was he in the army? It's got to have been decades now. But actually, he wasn't in the army. They made him up. But he was based on how the Southern people particularly liked to, if they got a certain rank that was impressive, they just kept it for the rest of their life. And the Romans would do the same thing. So that's possible, that he's a Roman, that he's done with his duty, and that he's in this area. And if you think about 25 years of service, they would have started sometime between 16 and 18. He still might have been a relatively young person, but he, of course, might have been older also. And a kind person, a thoughtful person. He not only cares about his servant, he's not like, ensign expendable. If he dies, I'll just get another one. He cares about him. And he cares not to step on Jesus' toes, not to be kind of, hey, I'm the Roman, I do what I want, I say what I want, I get who I want in where I want, and I tell him to do what I want. That's not his attitude, although it might have been. And there were lots of Roman centurions that had that kind of an attitude. A couple other people that are called centurions in the New Testament. In the crucifixion account, it says, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that happened, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. And the picture here you get is the centurion as being kind of in charge of the troops that are there to make sure that nobody takes the people off the crosses before they're dead, kind of make sure that everything happens properly. But this centurion, as kind of speaking as a Gentile foreigner, sees what happens with Jesus and the earthquake and the darkness and the things that he says, and it's like, wow, this is impressive. And some translations will say, truly this was a son of a god. That might have been a more natural thing for a Roman centurion to say. But it's also possible that if he was in Jerusalem, he might have kind of known what was going on with the Jesus movement before the crucifixion. And he may have been saying, I think this guy is who he said he was, based on what I've seen. If so, he was the first outsider to really make that much of a bold statement about Jesus, and a centurion. Not someone you would expect to say these words. Of course, Cornelius was a centurion, and Cornelius is an important part of the early entrance of the gospel into the Gentile world, where Peter is up, getting hungry, waiting for a meal, and gets the great sheet vision, and God says, if I say something's clean, you eat it if I say to eat it. And then he gets called to a Gentile's house. Well, Cornelius is that Gentile, and he is a centurion. And interestingly, again, we see the position that the centurion played in the Jewish world. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household, who gave alms generously to the people, and prayed to God always. So he might have been a Gentile. He was what was called in those days a God-fearer, someone who didn't become Jewish, but thought, I think the Jewish God is God. I'm on that. But just did not go through the process of becoming Jewish themselves. And here he had the resources, like this other centurion in Capernaum, he had the resources to give generously, and was a pious, devout person. And of course, Peter comes, proclaims the gospel, and he's saved, and his household. They hear the good news, and they believe, and they begin speaking in tongues, just like Peter and the other apostles had it just back in Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And Peter will go back to Jerusalem and say, these people have to be Christians because we saw the same thing happen to them that happened to us at the beginning of the church. So, very important person in the history, early history of the church, Cornelius, a centurion. Paul has lots of experiences with soldiers. Most of them not good. Okay? He gets involved with soldiers quite a bit. And as Paul has different things happen, a lot of time the size of unit we want to do something that has Paul involved, the guy that's in charge of those soldiers is called a centurion. Okay? And so when Paul is about to get torn apart by the crowds in Jerusalem because they say, he's come here, he's brought Gentiles into the temple grounds, we need to tear him apart. The commander of the garrison hears that there's this commotion going on, and he takes soldiers and centurions and runs down to them. So what that probably means is he takes 2 or 3 centuries of soldiers, which actually was fairly common in Jerusalem. They didn't go like, we're just going to get like 3 intimidating looking guys, and we'll go settle that crowd with them. They had masses of troops, and they would do that. When the crowd saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. And so when it says immediately he took soldiers and centurions, he may have taken 2 centuries worth of soldiers. He may have taken 3 centuries worth of soldiers, but he took a good-sized group. And as the crowd saw this good-sized group of soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. And that whole picture kind of cracks me up, where they're tearing him and pounding on him, and then here come the soldiers all marching down with their shields and swords and plumes and everything, and they're like, someone pulls Paul behind their back. It's like, nothing to see here. And anyhow, and they end up taking him off. In Acts 22, when they're binding Paul and about to beat him, Paul turns to a centurion who's standing by. And so what we know from history is that centurion would have also been a Roman citizen, and said, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is Roman and uncondemned?" And the centurion, hearing that, tells the commander, who might or might not have been Roman, saying, "Take care what you do. This man is a Roman." So the centurion speaks out for Paul because they would have shared that Roman bond. And by the way, one of the interesting things about the Roman just system is, if you were to ask a Roman, what is it that makes Rome great? Despite some of the things that you read in history books, they would have pretty much universally said what makes Rome great is justice. They were all about justice. And a parallel to that would be, in our country, a buzzword that is super, super important to us is freedom. Freedom is like a big deal to Americans. The Romans didn't care about freedom. That was not a big deal to them. But justice was a big deal. And that's why, we have relatives in Canada that, are dealing with the whole virus and vaccination and things like that. Their process is completely different in Canada than down here. It's different. So their thing was justice, and so this was part of the justice, and it was the Roman soldiers' job to make sure that justice happened, and particularly, and this is how things work, particularly justice for Romans. And I will say that that's probably parallel also to America. We'd love everybody to have freedom, but mostly us. That's kind of how it ends up really working in the world. But here, he's like, whoa, he's a Roman. We need to not do anything there. And then, as Paul is getting carted off to in his process of his, kind of 4th missionary journey, centurions again are involved with him. So Paul has direct contact with several centurions, more than any other person that we see as it's described in the New Testament. Paul called one of the centurions, so evidently there were multiple centurions where he's being guarded, and says, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." This is the one that said, there's a bunch of Jewish people that said they want Paul to come to Jerusalem, and we're going to kill him before he gets there. And so he says, "Oh, you need to tell the commander." And so he calls one of the centurions in to make sure that the job is done right. Once the commander hears, it says he called 2 centurions, saying, "Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. And probably what this would be is 200 legionnaires plus a variety of horsemen and spearmen from the auxiliary troops that would have been there. And so 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the third hour of the night. And then in Acts 27, we see that as they're taking Paul to Rome, after they decide, if he wants to appeal to Rome he will go. He gets a centurion put in charge of him. And we actually know that centurion's name. That centurion's name is Julius. So that's kind of interesting. We don't know a lot of the other centurions' names. I think we had a cantata several years ago where the centurion that saw, that said, this must be the Son of God's name was Marcus. That's not in the Bible. They made that up just because Marcus sounds like a Roman name, which it is. But here, Julius, which, by the way, Julius, if you didn't know this already, also a Roman name. If you remember Julius Caesar, he kind of made it popular at this time period. And he was part of the Augustan regiment, so kind of a central Italy-Rome group. And the centurion is in charge of Paul, and when the ship is going to get wrecked, he's the one Paul has to convince not to kill all the prisoners. So it's his job. He's the guy in charge, giving the orders. And the centurion is the one who decides, because he wants to save Paul, he's going to allow all the prisoners to live. So that's kind of interesting. And so he commands the prisoners and the soldiers to jump overboard and swim, grab a plank or something, and try to get to land best you can. Then there's one more group of centurions in Scripture, at least the word for centurion, and I know you've been dying to see it up on the wall, or if you're on YouTube, to see it up on the screen next to me. There it is. Hekatontarches. What does that mean? That means ruler of 100. It's the Greek word that gets translated centurion in all of the verses I just gave you. This is the word, ruler of 100. So it makes sense that they would use the word centurion for it, because that's what centurion means. And so that's the word. Well, it turns out that when Josiah is made king, the priest has to make sure that the transition of power takes place properly, because the queen mother is going to try to kill all the princes. And you remember kind of that story, perhaps. And they're going to take her, and they're going to put her to death. And part of that is they're going to wait till there's a changing of the guards. Only right when the guards are all changing, they're going to suddenly take him and promote him to king. And in order to do this, the priest gives to all of the captains of the hundreds, and so you can see both Hebrew, which is Lasare ha Yod, Yot, which means the leader of the hundreds. So this leader of the hundreds is a word that gets used of the Hebrew system, the Roman system, and we use the word centurion for the guy that was in charge of those people. And the reason I add this to our list is just to remind you, one thing we know about these captains is they weren't centurions, right? This is before Rome had invented centurions. And so the word gets used, but it can have a broader meaning. And the word, as it gets used in the New Testament, gets translated centurion. So all that to say, the centurion of our particular story may not have been an actual Roman centurion. It may just be us mistranslating the Greek word that they use for people that were that level of authority. Okay? Now, how much does that matter? When it comes to his character, it doesn't matter a bit. When it comes to his role in the story, it doesn't matter a bit. There are times where being a Roman citizen or being part of the legionnaires versus being part of the auxiliary forces, where that would make a difference. But here, it doesn't make a difference at all. What this person is this person is someone who, one, has a lot of resources, and two, understands how power works. Because he lives in a system where everything is about where you are in the authority structure. And you know, some of you have made it a whole life without ever being part of the military. And some of you haven't. And those who have been through the military, there's a different appreciation for power structures. There are certain people that when they walk into the room, you stand up and salute. And there are other people, when they walk into the room, you don't. There are people that when they say you ought to do something, they mean you will do that or bad things will happen fairly quickly. And other people, it doesn't matter how much they want you to do it. They just can't make you. And so he's part of this big system, and he realizes that Christ is also a man of power. And by the way, Christ is. He is in the system. Here is how the New Testament presents Christ in the system. You have God the Father, and under him is Jesus. And Jesus does whatever his Father wants him to do. And by the way, that's why we use the words Father and Son to talk about those two members of the Trinity. Below Jesus, and I realize the Eastern Orthodox Church and some others want to put the Holy Spirit level with Jesus, but there are certain scriptures that seem to indicate that Jesus is the one that's giving the Holy Spirit his marching orders. Now, that's the Trinity. What's under the Trinity? Everything else. Everything else. And this fella may not understand that level of theology, but here's what he knows. Here's someone who can tell the universe what to do. That he can say from a distance to whoever he needs to say it to, I want that servant healed. And whether it's powers or he being someone that's giving to the synagogue and probably a God-fearer, he probably is assuming that angels are going to be kind of the Jesus lackeys that he says, hey, go take care of that. But he's like, you don't need to come. You're too important to come. And and that's something that was very much a part of his world. And he was in the middle of having people under him and having people over him. Now, as we finish up, I want to just, while we're thinking about this, the life of soldiers and centurions and legions and Roman army, I just want to have some quick things to take with you, because I realize a history lesson, you may not go and live differently because now you know the difference between the cohort commander and the legionnaire, or the legate being in charge of the legion. Here's some things now place in the society, but it was also a place that was kind of its own thing within society. So in Luke 3, you get soldiers who come to John the Baptist and they ask him, what shall we do? We want to repent. We want to do right. What should we do? What practically should we do? This is what John the Baptist says to them. Do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with your wages. It's kind of an interesting set of things for these soldiers to do. But here's what's going on. And they did a job that people didn't love them for. And probably most people who have hard jobs that people don't love you for, they thought they ought to make more at it. And John the Baptist says, be content. Be content with what you have. And so that's kind of interesting. And so as we have positions of power or authority or importance or whatever, I think these are things that we can take to our own heart. Don't be intimidating. Don't accuse people falsely. Be content with the things. But most armies across time have said, you know what, we're going to equip you. Because if you're part of the core group, we want to make sure your sword is made out of the right kind of steel. We want to make sure that your armor looks like other people's armor. That is important. The reason I use that is because where do you get this armor? I would suggest that God gives it to you to use. That he equips us so that we can do this stuff. And so listen to this from this, because we a lot of times tend to think, oh no, we got to work ourselves up and we got to do it and it's all on us. Jesus Christ dying for your sins. And that's not the gospel because you think it's good news. That's the gospel because it is good news. Above all, taking the shield of faith. Now, you might say, now hold on, Pastor. I know one thing. Faith comes from me. Everything else might come from God, but faith is mine. Well, it might be your faith, but it came from God. That he was using. using to parry the blows. That was his. He used God's word in order to show Satan that his line of thinking was incorrect and not right. All right. So that's the second, is that these things that we think of as our spiritual, that's like telling a soldier, we're going to, and sometimes recruiters will do things similar to this, we're going to have you in and we're just going to take super good care of you. You get nice clothes, you get good food, you get purpose in life, you get to get away from your parents, you get all these nice things, you get money, you get bonuses. And at the end of the day, you gain a skill that you can use to make a lot of money after you're out. That's one way of recruiting. The other way, which is actually more effective, is what we do is hard, and I mean really hard. And not many people can handle it, but maybe you can. We need to make sure that we recognize that when we follow Jesus, we follow him as his soldier. He's in charge, and it might get hard. And it might be hard over a period of time. That's where the endure word comes from. And changes like a fundamental level of what you do. Is, I think, a lesson that we can learn. We can learn from the life of soldiers, as Paul uses that as an example for those who would follow Christ. All right, so there's a little bit about centurions and soldiers, and hopefully the centurion. We tend to think as Americans that we ought to be the ones in control.